Good evening. So we owe you all a debt of gratitude for sharing in our parking lot trauma. So thank you for your perseverance. I'm Steve Weberg. I'm with public affairs staff of the Kansas City Public Library, and it is great to have all of you here with us this evening, and we do appreciate your perseverance in maneuvering our parking detour. Also, thanks to all of you watching this via our live stream, sitting much more comfortably in front of a computer screen. One quick reminder before we begin tonight. We're just a little more than 3 weeks away from our first Heartland Book Festival. It will be the end of the first week in October, Friday and Saturday, the 6th and the 7th. Friday night, the kickoff is at the Folly Theater. Saturday, an entire day of activities, speaking presentations at the and otherwise at the Central Library, just a few blocks away. We're excited about this. There are only just a small handful of annual book festivals around the state of Missouri or the state of Kansas, and there have only been a very few, if any, beyond maybe a one-off or two here in Kansas City. And we're partnering with the Missouri Humanities, which is based in St. Louis, and with the Missouri chapter of the Center for the Book. And in doing this and envision it as an annual book festival that will move around Missouri, but we're figuring on regular stops here in Kansas City. We've got an exciting lineup of authors, both national names and a who's who of state and local authors. There will be workshops, musical performances, a lot of activities geared to families and children, and we hope you will maybe mark that on your calendar again the end of the last week in October and join us. Tonight, we welcome back our very close partner, the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, and an old friend, Richard Barbuto. Rich spoke at the library 4 times in less than 3 years. The last time on Napoleon and Waterloo in 2015, so 8 years ago. And he hasn't been back since then. He retired from the Command and General Staff College in 2016. So we're thrilled to get him back with us tonight to discuss a very interesting subject, and the subject that's absolutely in his wheelhouse, the War of 1812. Often gets overlooked, I think, in our country's history, but in actuality was really quite significant as what's often called the Second War for American Independence. Rich is a professor emeritus of military history at the Command and General Staff College, and he's former deputy director of the college's Department of Military History. He's a 1971 graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He served for 23 years as an Army armor officer, earned a doctorate in American history from KU, has written a number of books and a number of articles on the War of 1812, most recently, New York's War of 1812, Politics, Society, and Combat. As always tonight, we'll leave time at the end of our program for Q&A, and we'll ask everybody here to use the microphones that we'll set up in front here. Rich will be instructed to make sure, if you try to yell out a question from the audience, to please use the mic, and that's because we are live streaming, and people at home will not be able to hear your question if you're not in front of a microphone. And those of you at home can enter questions anytime, and we'll get to them in the YouTube chat box. So now, would you please join me in welcoming Rich Barbuto back to the Kansas City Public Library. Rich?
Thank you all for being here this evening to hear me speak on America's Forgotten War. The War of 1812 has indeed been forgotten and forgotten a long time. There was an event in World War II that might support this thought. General Eisenhower was Supreme Allied Commander. He's planning the D-Day invasion. He's building up his big planning group, his planning organization. He wanted to integrate the officer corps. So if the head of a department was an American, then the deputy was British. If the head of a department was British, then his deputy would be an American. And in one of these departments, that was the case. It was headed by a British brigadier, and his deputy was an American infantry colonel. The colonel despised his boss, almost with contempt. And the brigadier put up with it for a while, but eventually things came to a head, and so he confronted his deputy and asked him what was the cause of this situation. Was it something that he had done? So the American colonel pulls himself up to his full height, stares the brigadier in the face and says, "The British burned Washington." The brigadier was just knocked back on his heels. He was surprised, he was mortified, and he was speechless for a while. But he finally pulled himself together and he said to the colonel, he said, "Well, of course I knew we burned Joan of Arc. I had no idea we burned George Washington." There we go. We're going to talk, the war lasted 2.5 years. We're going to talk about a 7-day period, but we will cover the background to get us there, and that may take a little bit of a while. In this time, this is only 31 years after the American Revolution. The Americans who will fight this war are the children and grandchildren of revolutionary heroes. They're full of certainly patriotism, love of country, and commitment to defending America and establishing its place in the world. But as the war goes very poorly, there's a real chance that the British are going to seize a large chunk of American territory. And New England was actually threatening secession. But the successful military action, 3 events over a 7-day period, completely reversed this, and tonight you're going to hear that story. The war starts in Europe between Britain and Napoleonic France. They've been fighting for years. It's an existential conflict between the two powers here. And it turns into an economic war. Napoleon starts the continental system. He's blocking all the ports in Europe that are under French control, which is most of them, from importing any British goods. What the British do is they prevent any goods carried by neutral carriers, the United States, from bringing goods into these ports. And so Royal Navy captains were stopping American merchant vessels on the high seas, seizing the cargo, seizing the ship, calling up the crew, and lining them up and speaking to them. And if any of them replied in a British accent, that person was obviously born in the British Empire. He cannot give up his citizenship, therefore he owes military service, and we're going to draft you right here, right now, and brings him over to the Royal Navy vessel. Now, you remember the movie Master and Commander, perhaps, what great fun it was to be on a British warship during this war. 3 squares a day, you sing sea shanties, everyone in peace and love. And rum. The actual living conditions on a British warship for the crew was horrific. It was like serving as a galley slave. You did not leave your vessel for fear that you were going to leave the crew. Those people who could leave the crew ran quickly to an American merchant vessel and signed on because the pay was a lot better, and at the end of the cruise you could do what you wanted. So what we have here is impressment, drafting. We have seizure of cargoes and ships. This goes on for years. The State Department collects the names of over 6,000 sailors serving on American merchant vessels that were impressed into the Royal Navy. Scholars today say that number is much closer to 15,000, and hundreds of ships are being seized throughout the years. Now, also, the British up in Canada wanted to corner the fur trade. And the way they did this was by trading for furs with the Native Americans. They would trade muskets and gunpowder and incite the natives and encourage them to push back on white expansion westward. Now, the Native Americans didn't need much incitement to do that, but the people on the frontier are in constant warfare with the indigenous population, and they blame the British for providing weapons and gunpowder. Okay, all that together impinges on the national pride of young America, and President Madison sends a war message to Congress in June of 1812, and Congress goes ahead and declares war on the British Empire. Now here's a quick strategic comparison. You can see the numbers. I only bring your attention to these here. The Royal Navy, 120 ships of the line and 116 frigates. These are all on active duty. The U.S. Navy has 7 frigates. So we're not going to have an amphibious invasion of Great Britain. We got to figure out another way to win this war. So what President Madison does is this. He's got these 3 goals. Respect neutral shipping rights. If we're not carrying contraband, we could take cargoes to any port we want to. Stop stealing our sailors and stop inciting the Indians on the American frontier. His strategy is simple. He's going to seize Canada, and then in negotiations, he will trade it back to the British, who will give him those 3 concessions. He will also inflict commercial damage by privateering. He will give licenses to American merchant vessels to carry cannon and to stop British merchant vessels and seize them and bring those cargoes to America. Now, if negotiations fail, the United States is going to keep Canada. What does it mean to take Canada? Well, almost the entire white population of Canada lives along the waterways. Therefore, the key to taking Canada is to seize Montreal, and this cuts the supply line for everything to the west of that. There can be no British naval forces or military forces because they'll be cut off from their supplies. So in 1812, there are 3 invasions of Canada. The first one here, William Hull crosses the Detroit River. He's in Canada for about 2 weeks. And between Tecumseh and General Isaac Brock, they not only push him back to the city of Detroit, they capture Detroit, and upwards on 500 Americans are taken prisoner, and the British assert their control over the entire Michigan territory. So the opening campaign, we lose ground. General Van Rensselaer takes about 4,000 people, mostly militia. He crosses the Niagara River. They fight 1 battle on Queenston Heights. Over 900 Americans there are captured and sent to POW camps in Nova Scotia. Cold in the wintertime. The last invasion, General Dearborn crosses the border of New York heading towards Montreal. He gets about 12 miles into Canada. He comes against a defensive position that he cannot overcome. So he turns around and marches back to Plattsburgh, which was the American naval and military base in the area. Now, the good things that happened in the first 6 months of the war is the United States Navy, hate to say it, in these ship-to-ship battles, the Americans are winning. Frigate to frigate, the American gunnery is better than the British gunnery. The Royal Navy goes nuts when this happens. This is inconceivable to them that the Americans, who really haven't been much of a war, are beating our frigates on the high seas. Also, the Navy is capturing a bunch of merchantmen, and the privateers are doing the same. Now, sounds good, good press, the Americans loved it, totally irrelevant to the war aims. We can't do this forever. We can't take on 120 ships of the line and 116 frigates. This is going to end at some point, and it does in 1813. So this isn't moving us any closer to the war. So after 6 months of the war, Detroit's lost. The Native Americans are attacking across the entire frontier. They see an opportunity, while America's involved in a foreign war, to push settlements back, and they have some success. Over 800 soldiers are still in POW camps, nearly 500 killed and wounded. The Navy's triumphant but irrelevant, and the Royal Navy gets orders to blockade all the ports on the American Atlantic coast. So now they are choking off what foreign trade still existed. In 1813, the Royal Navy pulls into Chesapeake Bay, grabs a strategically situated island, makes it a naval base, and starts raiding American villages up and down Chesapeake Bay to steal the ships that are at anchor there. And if the militia of that village reacts to resist the attack, then the Royal Navy burns all the civilian houses. They also offer freedom to the enslaved population, and upwards on 5,000 enslaved persons sneak off the plantation, move to the coast. British vessel is out there, sends ships, boats to them, evacuates them, the families, brings them on board the Royal Navy vessels, and relocates them to British Isles in the Caribbean. A big enticement for the enslaved population. This is the Royal Navy's opportunity to inflict pain in the center of the country and also tie down regular Army troops to keep them from moving north into Canada. You could see here the towns that were burned and how many vessels were killed. They would also go to plantations, to the warehouses, full of tobacco, huge market for tobacco in Europe, declare the tobacco to be cargo, seize it, bring it back on a Royal Navy vessel, eventually sell it, and the captain and crew get 50% of the proceeds. So the Royal Navy is real happy to burn down plantations after they've evacuated the tobacco. Now, a bright spot for the United States is the Battle of Lake Erie. Oliver Hazard Perry completely captures the British squadron on Lake Erie. It was a fairly even fight. And in doing so, Lake Erie becomes an American lake. The British can no longer supply their troops in Detroit. So Tecumseh and the native warriors of his confederation and the British troops move eastward to escape. William Henry Harrison, future president, brings an army of about 4,000 people, mostly Kentuckians. They catch up to Tecumseh and the British, overwhelm them. Tecumseh is killed. Many of the British are captured. Some manage to escape further east. And so now the Michigan Territory is liberated. In 1813, there are 4 invasions of Canada. We talked about this one, the one that worked. General Dearborn crosses the Niagara River. He has some initial success, but eventually the British force him back, and he's holed up there until December when his army moves elsewhere. In November, James Wilkinson, leaving out of Sackett's Harbor, and Wade Hampton, leaving out of Plattsburgh, 2 attacks moving directly on Montreal. These are supporting attacks, would converge on Montreal, bringing over 10,000 Americans to the walls of Montreal. Both of these invasions are stopped cold by the British and Canadian militia, even though the Americans greatly outnumbered the opposition. And so those invading forces fall back into the United States. So after 18 months of war, here's what we got. Nations utterly divided. The Federalist Party, which is the anti-war and opposition party, gets great strength. Madison is just ridiculed in the press. The partisan politics are very fierce indeed. Foreign trade is virtually shut down. National debt, war is expensive, and the national debt is just skyrocketing. The peace negotiations are at a standstill. The 2 sides can't even agree where they're going to hold the peace talks. So in 1813, there are no peace talks. Detroit's recovered. The Niagara frontier, along the Niagara River, as soon as the regular army leaves, the Canadians and British and the remains of Tecumseh's native warrior force, about 400 warriors, cross the Niagara River. They burn every dwelling, every store, every warehouse, every barn, every outhouse, with the exception of about 2 homes, in December in New York. There's a fella here from Niagara Falls. Yeah, how cold is it in December in Niagara Falls? Yeah. 6,000 Americans who lived along the river are forced to evacuate in December into the forest, heading towards Batavia and the city that is now Rochester. Many of them don't come back to their homes because their homes are gone. The 3 invasions of Canada that are turned back. Now, in Alabama is the Creek Nation. Roughly 40% of the Creek Nation go into insurrection against the United States. They were called the Red Sticks. So while they are in insurrection, the local governors around what is now Alabama send their militia to quell this. The most successful commander is Andrew Jackson with his Tennessee troops, and he eventually ends the Red Stick War, the Creek War. Madison is the lowest possible presidential approval rating. Now, between 1812 and 1814, here's some of the data. Customs is 90% of the Treasury's income, and trade's been shut down, so the customs income plummets. National debt skyrockets. The consumer price index is believed to be raised roughly 40% across the board for all Americans, and the federal government is facing default because they don't have enough money coming in to pay their current bills. So the war is going to grind to a halt in 1814 with this situation ongoing. Then in April of 1814, Napoleon's defeated. So that window of opportunity for America to wage war against Britain while Britain was occupied fighting Napoleon, that just ended. The American public knows full well what's going to happen next. They get the British or the European newspapers. There's only about a 5-week delay, so they know what's happening. They know Napoleon's gone. They know that there are tens of thousands of trained and experienced British troops in Spain and in France ready to cross the Atlantic, and they know there are hundreds of Royal Navy warships that used to be blockading ports that are now heading west across the Atlantic, and it's going to hit somewhere. How did this appear to the American public? Now, Secretary of State James Monroe has a correspondent living an American living in London legally, and he writes to Madison here, and I'm going to read you this extract from his letter. There are so many people, Londoners, so many who delight in war, that I have less hope than ever of our being able to make peace. You will perceive by the newspapers that a very great force is to be sent from Bordeaux to the United States, and the order of the day is division of the states and conquest. The more moderate of these people thinks that when our seaboard is laid waste, and we are made to agree to a line which shall exclude us from the lake, meaning the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain, and give up a part of our claim on Louisiana, turning over New Orleans, peace may be made with us. Pretty draconian, huh? And the British believe their own press. This is Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane. He commands all the Royal Navy in the Western Atlantic, and he's getting ships and men and Marines and soldiers all pulling into ports in Canada, and he's going to be striking this blow. And he gets orders to do so. And in his response to the ministry, he says this: I have it much at heart to give them a complete drubbing before peace is made, when I trust their northern limits will be circumscribed, move the border south, and the command of the Mississippi wrested from them, give up New Orleans. Finally, peace negotiations open up in Ghent. That's a city that now is in the country of Belgium. Belgium didn't exist in 1814. And there's a spirit of revenge, but also the fur interests and the commercial interests want to pursue this war, because if the borders move south, then those furs are trapped in British territory, not American territory. So the demands are these. The British want an Indian buffer state north of the Ohio River, everything north of the Ohio River, the state of Ohio included. And this will be a buffer zone between British North America and the United States, and it will be administered by Great Britain. This is the sine qua non. That means to say, Americans, if you want this treaty, if you want peace, without this, nothing. We must have that, otherwise there will be no peace treaty. Additionally, you have to remove all your naval forces from the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain, and additionally, we get free transit of the Mississippi River. We won't pay you customs. And this connects Canada with the Gulf of Mexico. Very convenient in the wintertime when the North Atlantic is iced over and nasty. It takes 5 weeks for these demands to cross the ocean and get to Washington, and the response back to them saying, yeah, we can't do this, you're going to have to do something better, we have to negotiate a better peace. It's politically impossible to give in to any of this here. Meanwhile, the British aren't waiting for the American response. They burn Washington. Now, when I say they burn Washington, that's true. They do burn a couple private residences from which they receive sniper fire. They're burning the public buildings, the Naval Yard, the Capitol, the White House. Those get burned. And another force goes to Maine, occupies a bunch of the coast, with every intention of retaining that section of northern Maine after the war. Now, America's got to do something about this all. The American Army is very young. The officers are young. It's not a professional army yet. People are still learning their jobs even after a year and a half of war. Now, I found photographic proof of this, a photograph that was taken in 1814 of the U.S. Army. You're the first audience ever to see this. Okay, you caught me. The original photograph was black and white. I had it colorized for tonight's presentation. But these are the events over 7 days that are going to change the whole course of the war. The Battle for Plattsburgh, the defense of Baltimore, and finally there was an American division under siege in Fort Erie, right across the river from Buffalo, and they were trapped. They had their backs against the lake. There was no way to evacuate them, and they were under siege. And they're going to actually sortie and escape from that, break that siege. Let's talk about the first event. Governor General Prevost of British North America himself leads 10,000 troops from Montreal to take the Army and Navy base there at Plattsburgh. About 9,000 of these troops are going to end up at Plattsburgh. Most of the people in Plattsburgh get out of the village as best they can. Some stay, and there aren't enough American either soldiers or sailors, they don't think, to defend this. But the Army and the Navy stay to defend what they have in Plattsburgh, and we'll be talking about that. And that's led, the Navy, by this gentleman here, Thomas McDonough. He's got some experience in the Barbary War. He's sent in 1812 to go to Lake Champlain and build a squadron. He's got nothing. So he buys some schooners. They start building some ships in Plattsburgh and Burlington, and he eventually puts a squadron together. And we'll compare his squadron to the Royal Navy squadron in a moment. In 1813, he's promoted to Master Commandant. Master Commandant was equivalent to the British rank of Master and Commander, equivalent ranks. In the Army, that's roughly a lieutenant colonel. So this is not an experienced admiral. This is a person who's never commanded a ship in combat and certainly has never commanded a whole squadron of warships in combat. The Army is commanded in Plattsburgh by Alexander McComb. He comes from a rich family, a fur trading family. He's born in Detroit. The family's based in New York City, politically very well connected. This guy is smart, highly competent, well connected, joins the Army in 1799 as a dragoon, thinks that engineering is better, becomes an Army engineer. He is at the first class at West Point in 1802, but since he's already a commissioned officer, he's not considered a graduate of West Point. But he took the course with the two cadets who did graduate, the first two cadets graduating from West Point. Now, in a time when in the Army, when you could be a captain for 25, 30 years, retire as a captain, this guy's rise is absolutely meteoric. He goes promoted to captain after being a lieutenant for 3 years. 3 years later, he's a major. 2 years later, he's a lieutenant colonel. In 1812, before the war starts, he is promoted to be a full colonel in the artillery because now he can command soldiers. Engineers are not supposed to command troops in combat. They're specialists, they're not combat leaders. He wants to be a combat leader, and he is. He's so successful as a regimental commander during the first couple of years of the war that in 1814 he's promoted to brigadier general. Now, this here is a busy slide. I'll talk you through it. It's kind of important to the outcome of the battle. Here in the lower left-hand corner, you see a 24-pounder. When you talk about naval guns, that's kind of what you think of. There was another gun called a carronade here. This gun with a shorter barrel had much shorter range, but it fired a much bigger iron ball. While this is a 24-pounder gun, meaning a solid iron ball weighing 24 pounds, a carronade, a small one, would fire a 24-pounder, a 32-pounder, a 48-pound iron ball, but it would only reach out about 400 yards. So it's a short-range weapon. But if that iron ball hit a ship, it was going to punch a hole through it. Now, you measure the firepower of a ship in throw weight. The throw weight is if you took all the cannons and weighed the iron balls that they fired, this is the poundage you would do in a single volley. So the British, most of their throw weight comes from their long-range guns. They do have carronades, which have a smaller throw weight. So there's the total from the Royal Navy Squadron. The U.S. Navy has a lower throw weight, and in the U.S. Navy, most of the throw weight comes from its carronades. Now, the tactical advantage is with the British. If they can stand off 401 yards away from the U.S., none of those carronade balls are going to hit their ships. So it behooves them to do this battle at 500, 600, 700 yards when they're safe from the carronades. And the American carronades won't hit, and so those gun crews, I don't know, sit around playing pinochle or something because they've got nothing to do in the battle. All right. So here's how the Battle of Plattsburgh works out. The Royal Navy Squadron comes down here, turns into Cumberland Head. All right. The village is occupied by British. The American Army is in this little peninsula here, Saranac River on their left, Plattsburgh Bay on their right. These bridges have been destroyed. These are 3 redoubts constructed of earth. The troops, with their shovels and whatnot, threw up redoubts. Macomb himself was with a shovel throwing dirt to inspire his troops with a sense of urgency that we're staying here. And if you haven't figured it out, there's absolutely no escape. There's no number of boats that can take our 6,000 troops and get them out of our camp. So it's kind of fight or die. The American soldiers know that if they don't get killed, they will be captured. There's no escape. Okay, what McDonough does, and this is an integrated defense, McDonough puts his ships, anchors them in line, far enough away from the forts so that the Royal Navy can't fire into the forts and support a land attack. Now, what McDonough's in the flagship Saratoga. What he tells these warship commanders to do is this, and they've read about it in books, but they probably never did it. You anchor your warship, so the flank is pointing towards the enemy. All right. McDonough does not have enough artillerists, gun crewmen, to man all of his guns. So this way he only needs half as many because they're only going to be on the starboard side of the ship, right? Now, what he does is he takes a cable, puts an anchor on it from the front of his ship, puts it in a boat, and on the port side of the boat, brings it to the rear of the ship and drops the anchor. He takes another anchor, puts it on a cable at the rear of the ship, puts it in a boat, and it goes up the starboard side of the boat, and then it drops the anchor there. So you've got two cables with anchors on them on each side of the ship. They're connected to a capstan. You probably see this if you see any of these old-time Navy movies. The capstan, you see the guys walking around in a circle, and you wonder what they're doing. They can be doing a lot of things, but what they're really doing is they're pulling the cable back into the ship. So when, for example, when the Saratoga loses its guns to combat on the right hand, the starboard side, he can tell the sailors, pull the cables in, and the ship will rotate 180 degrees, and he'll have all the fresh guns that were on the port side, right? The crews run from one side of the ship to the other, and they continue fighting. Now, the Royal Navy makes the turn into the bay. What they were going to do, what they were hoping to do, is line ahead, take the whole line and run it between, for example, the Saratoga and Ticonderoga, and every ship fires guns from both port and starboard as they're going through the line, and the Americans can't return fire. Okay. But they don't do that because as soon as they turn to Plattsburgh Bay, the wind dies. And so with very little wind, they pull into this position here, their own line, they drop cables, they drop anchors, and the fight starts. And the Royal Navy was within 400 yards of the U.S. squadron. So it's a very even, a very heated, a very deadly exchange of iron going back and forth. All right. In this fight, eventually, the Saratoga just does exactly that. It reverses itself. And this is the British flagship, the Confiance. There's the Saratoga. There's the American warships online. When Saratoga rotates, the captain of the Confiance wants to do the same thing. So they throw an anchor in the boat from the front of the vessel, they run it to the rear of the vessel, and they start turning the capstan, they start drawing the cable in, and slowly the Confiance turns until it gets there about 90 degrees perpendicular to the American line of fire. And now all the fire from Saratoga is going right across the line, the deck of Confiance. The British sailors are very brave, but they weren't brave enough to keep pulling on that capstan when all this iron is bouncing across the deck. And so they run for cover. Confiance is dead in the water, has no guns that are firing forward, and is being basically blown apart, blown to pieces by Saratoga. The captain of Confiance takes down the flag, surrenders, and the other British warships, who have been similarly treated in this fight, surrender as well. So Macdonough has won the Battle of Plattsburgh Bay. Now, there's still a land battle coming up. British Army, 9,000. Macomb's got a bunch of regulars. Most of them have never seen combat. He's got a lot of militia from Vermont and New York. So he is numerically inferior to the British, but in level of experience, much less experienced than the British forces. Okay, now, as you can see from the photograph in the upper right, the American leadership was new, it was young, it was not particularly professional. They were kind of learning their craft as they went along. And you could say all those things bad about the officer corps in 1814, but one thing you got to give them, they were well fed, weren't they? So, while the naval battle is going on, the British Army goes through the woods, fords the river, the Saranac, gets here, and here, and there's 2 brigades of them. They're lined up, they're fixing bayonets, they see the redoubts in front of them. They're about ready to attack when General Prevost realizes he's lost a naval battle, and he calls off the attack. And the troops that were ready to make this attack are frustrated beyond measure. Their commanders are going to write back to the ministry that Prevost must have been a coward for not launching this attack. What was going through Prevost's mind is this. He's Governor General of Canada. He takes responsibility for all of this. He's lost a naval battle. There's no way he can feed 9,000 soldiers in Plattsburgh. Can't do it. Therefore, to save his troops, he calls off the attack, and they withdraw to Montreal, and he has every intention of picking up this campaign in 1815. While this is going on, Baltimore Harbor, there's Fort McHenry, there's all the British in the world. In those days, this is the city of Baltimore. The civilians in Baltimore went out of the city. They connected all the high ground with trenches. They brought in cannon. These are the civilians doing this. While that's happening, here's Fort McHenry blocking the inner harbor. Admiral Cochrane shows up here. He drops about 4,000 troops. They're going to take the land route. They run into Americans here at a battle called North Point. And in this battle, the American militia do fairly well. They eventually have to withdraw, but they put up a stout fight. But an American sniper kills Robert Ross, the British commander. So command of this invading force devolves upon an infantry colonel. Not the same one we started the talk with, a different one. Okay, so what happens now is the British continue on. They do a reconnaissance of this line here, while Cochrane, way out of range here, sends 5 ships, warships, forward, just out of range of all of Fort McHenry's guns. 4 of these ships are mortars. They are firing huge iron balls that are hollow, filled with gunpowder, with fuses on them, high into the air, arcing, trying to drop them into Fort McHenry. And whether it's in the air or on the ground, eventually that fuse is going to hit the gunpowder. It's going to blow up with a lot of shrapnel. They also send out what they call a rocket ship. This ship is firing rockets, 1814 rockets, and this is the rockets red glare you hear about here. They're wildly inaccurate, but it's a bit of a terror weapon. So these things are just screaming across the harbor, attempting to drop into Fort McHenry. The bombardment goes on for 25 hours. The Americans can't return fire. It's estimated that out of all the rounds fired, about 400 of these bombs and rockets fall inside Fort McHenry, inflict very few casualties. And while this is going on, at dawn, Star-Spangled Banner, flag's still there, Cochrane gets word from the infantry colonel that's leading his invasion saying, there's no way I can break through this defensive position. I don't have any artillery, and the Americans do. I can't get through. I'm going back to where we started, and I hope you'll withdraw my troops and me out of there. Cochrane says, okay, I can't get through Fort McHenry. I can't get into the city, and the battle in Baltimore is saved. Baltimore, by the way, was the 3rd largest city in the United States of its time. It's not a village. It was a sizable town. Now let's talk about the last event, the Siege of Fort Erie. Again, a whole division of American troops are holed up under siege. This is what Fort Erie looks like, just a couple stone buildings. This has been rebuilt. If you go across the Peace Bridge from Buffalo, you can go straight into the fort, and it looks like this today. But the actual American camp, you've got Fort Erie up here. What the Americans got there a few days before the British did, they dug a ditch, threw up a parapet, and then they took a bunch of trees from the forest here. They sharpened the branches so that the sharpened branches are facing towards the enemy. They threw a very dense number of trees here, and it acts as barbed wire, because as the British are assaulting, they've got to get through this abattis, and while they're doing that, the Americans are up on the parapet firing down at them. And even if they manage to get through the abattis, now they got a ditch, so now they got to somehow climb up the ditch, up the parapet, and so that's not going to happen. Now what the Americans also do is take a big pile of sand here called Snake Hill, they level the top of it, they put a bunch of artillery right there. Now, General Drummond, who's in command of his division, he's going to make a night attack because his reconnaissance tells him that there's a big gap in the abattis down here. So if he can make an attack through the woods very silently in the dark, he could probably get through that gap and get behind the American encampment, break right into it. And he would send 2 other attacks to support that and tie down the Americans up here. So the American commander would think he's being attacked from the north, but really there's this bayonet assault going in from the south. And he tells all these troops, pull the flints out of your firelocks, take the flint out of the musket, because I don't want any of you tripping through the woods, discharging your weapon, and the American sentries hear you coming, and all of a sudden we have no surprise. So this attack miscarries right from the very beginning, because when Fisher and his troops get down here, this abattis has been closed. There is no gap there. They filled in the gap here. So they're caught right about here. The Americans on Snake Hill are opening fire with artillery, and a bunch of infantrymen are standing right there just firing volley after volley after volley of musketry into the British. That attack collapses, and as many as possible, the people escape, but a lot of them get captured there. These 2 assaults, Colonel Hercules Scott, he assaults here. He's killed leading his men. They can't break in to this position here. Colonel Drummond, who's no relation to this Drummond, he takes his men. He actually breaks into one of the bastions in Fort Erie, but he can't clear the fort. He tries to attack out. The Americans try to attack in. It's a stalemate. And nobody to this day knows how it happened, but all the ammunition that was in that bastion blows up and takes hundreds of British soldiers with it. So from the night attack, there you got an idea of what the casualties are. Just a completely bad night for the British Army. The Americans can't, thank heaven there aren't many American losses, because they can't make up these numbers. The British immediately make up these numbers here. It's like the attack never happened. He gets another 1,000, 1,200 troops coming in to replace these losses here. So now what Drummond is going to do is he's going to put 3 batteries in the woods here, surround them with trenches and abattis of their own, and he's going to have them fire down the length into the American camp. Most of the Americans are living in tents in this area here. That's a small area, tents everywhere. And for the next several weeks, cannonballs either land in Fort Erie or they clear the top of Fort Erie, hit the hard ground here, and bounce low across the ground, knocking over tents and people with them. So it's a real bad day for the Americans defending. Now, Jacob Brown, Major General, one of the most successful commanders in the War of 1812, he takes command of the troops here in Fort Erie. He's going to break the siege by breaking out and destroying these artillery pieces, because the British can't have a siege if they don't have any artillery, but he needs manpower. So the governor of New York sends him that manpower, calls up 3,000 militiamen. They go to Buffalo, and this man here, Brigadier General Peter B. Porter, if you live up there, everything is Porter this and Porter that in Buffalo and up the Niagara. He's famous up in those places there. One of the most competent militia generals during the war. He's also a war hawk. He's one of the guys that provoked this war. He lives right on the Niagara River. His house got burned down when everyone else's. He gathers these 3,000 troops in downtown Buffalo. It's in a drizzle. And he must have given them one heck of a speech, because the Constitution says militiamen don't have to fight outside the borders of the United States. But somehow he persuades 2,200 of them to go ahead. and join the attack. They hop in the boats, they go to the other side. So now the American attack, Porter's leading the main attack here, and General Miller's got his men in a gully here. And when Porter breaks out and overwhelms battery number 3, Miller will launch his attack. 2 forces will hit 2 and hit 1. That's pretty much how it happens. The Americans completely surprise the British in this area here. Overwhelm batteries 3, batteries 2, and in battery 1, there's a massive fight because all the troops that were, the British troops that weren't down here, they were resting elsewhere, they counterattack. So it's raining, gunpowder is wet, hand-to-hand, militia and regulars on both sides, and when it's all over, the guns are pretty much destroyed, and General Brown orders a withdrawal, and the people move back into Fort Erie. Here's the losses. They call this a sortie from Fort Erie, but it helps break the siege. General Davis, a New York militia general, killed. His men make it all the way to Battery 1. Eleazar Wood, a very competent engineer, and Colonel Gibson, both West Point graduates, both fatally wounded or killed at the head of their troops, and 2 generals, General Ripley and General Porter, are both wounded. Porter's actually captured for a while before his men can free him. And then 3 of the battalion commanders who made those counterattacks very seriously wounded. Now I've got 3 images down here. I'll go through them quickly. This is James Gibson when he's a colonel. And again, his rise was like Macomb's. It was just meteoric. This is a monument. This obelisk is at the West Point Cemetery. Jacob Brown, out of his own funds, had this built, placed at West Point, and this is the Wood Monument. So it's named after Eleazar Wood. Now, Statue of Liberty stands on a pedestal. Pedestal is placed on a War of 1812 stone fort. While this battle is going on, there are forts being built here on Liberty Island and on Ellis Island. The governor of New York names these forts Fort Wood and Fort Gibson. So that's Fort Wood there. Fort Gibson was on Ellis Island until it had to be taken down to build the immigration facility that we know on Ellis Island. Okay, the Duke of Wellington, very famous British general, very successful. After Napoleon is gone, he's made the ambassador to France. The ministry in London gets word that there's going to be an assassination attempt, and they want to get their greatest general out of Paris. And so they send him a letter saying, we'll send you to Vienna, the Congress of Vienna, where they're negotiating what Europe is going to look like, or we'll send you to be the commander in America, your choice. We are ready to place the decision entirely in your hands. We only request that you will lose no time in leaving Paris. Okay. Wellington basically tells them that we're not going to lose the war, but we're not going to win it either. And I'm going to read what his response is. That which appears to me lacking in America is not a new general, but naval superiority on the lakes. Talking about the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain. The question is whether we can acquire this naval superiority on the lakes. And if we can't, I'll do you but little good in America, and I'll go there only to sign a peace which you might as well sign right now. And of course, he's thinking about the Battle of Lake Erie and then the recent Battle of Lake Champlain. He also says this, and I hate reading this to you, but I will. I think you have no right from the state of the war to demand any concession of territory from America. You have not been able to carry the war into the enemy's territory. You've not even cleared your own territory of American forces. You cannot, on any principle of equality in negotiation, claim a cession of territory. That's pretty sobering for the ministry. Then if this reasoning be true, why stipulate for udi possidetis? You can get no territory. Indeed, the state of your military operations, however creditable, does not entitle you to demand any. Wow. The British think about that. The ministry's thinking about all of this, and they've read what Wellington had to say. The negotiations in Vienna are going very unsatisfactorily, and it's not impossible that the Allies who defeated Napoleon will end up fighting each other. France could resume the war at any time, whether Napoleon's there or not. Now we know that Napoleon eventually will return and the war will go on for 100 days. There's a huge British national debt and great opposition to new taxes. The people want to punish America, they just don't want to pay for it. There's pressure from the commercial interests to stop the war. They want trade with America to resume because that makes them a lot of money, especially post-war. And then Wellington's analysis puts the matters into very sharp relief. And so on the 24th of December, Christmas Eve, the two parties get together and they sign a peace treaty, status quo ante bellum, meaning all the borders go back to where they were at the start of the war. So, the results of the war. Britain and indeed much of Europe are a little less contemptuous of the United States. We're a republic, they are monarchies. There's a new waking within the American public of nationhood, patriotism, born of pride and confidence. And remember, about this time, Andrew Jackson wins the Battle of New Orleans. So Jackson is ultimately going to become president. The Native Americans are all but subdued. After Tecumseh is gone and the Red Stick Creeks are gone, there's not going to be any organized Indian pushback, and the white settlers are going to just flood into that area of the United States. And the anti-war party is basically accused of treason for wanting to stop this war because the Americans have won it, you see. And they disappear at the national level, and within a matter of years, even at the state level, there are no more Federalists. They disappear. So that's how, in a 7-day period, the United States was not dismembered and retains all the territory that it has today. So please, your questions.
Yes, sir. My question concerns prisoners of war on both sides. Could you discuss how they were handled, how they were treated, how they were housed, and because everything was pretty close to the front lines, how were prisoners of war, both American and British, handled?
Right. The British prisoners, especially, well, the officers could give their parole. They could say, okay, I agree that I'm not going to fight, and then they can, they're given limits, the city limits. For example, Frankfort, Kentucky had a lot of British prisoners, officers, and they could just walk around and be free until they were exchanged. The soldiers were kept under closer confinement, but again, fed pretty well, but hundreds of miles from the front lines. The Americans, most of them ended up in Halifax. Now, the American officers went to Quebec City where they were paroled. The American prisoners first went to Halifax and then were brought across the North Atlantic and put in the Dartmoor prison in Britain. And that was very nasty because at the end of the war, neither the British nor the Americans were willing to provide the ships to move those prisoners back to the United States. So a lot of them ended up, after the war, dying still in prison. And there was an uprising there, and the British Guards opened fire and killed a lot of Americans there. But eventually, those people were returned to the States. Does that answer your question? All right. Sir?
Yeah, I was wondering about the artillery. I mean, I know where the British got their artillery. They had the Industrial Revolution, right, going on. And it was both, I guess, field artillery, but also all these big guns in the forts. Where did we get all that?
We actually
artillery?
had foundries. Philadelphia is a big one,
Yeah.
Boston too, that actually cast our own guns. So this is, like I say, it's 30 years after the American Revolution.
Yeah.
The iron industry is really picking up. So most of the stuff we cast ourselves. But we also had guns that we had captured from the British, like at Yorktown, and they were still being
okay.
used.
So they didn't have to like haul them overland like they did with in the Revolutionary War.
They moved them by river mostly before the war and put them in place. But it was a long and very expensive endeavor. But we eventually moved a lot of guns into Philadelphia, New York City, and Boston. But they
Yeah, the
did that
Baltimore
actually during the war.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
And, given the results you show there, and maybe following up on the cartoon, why is the War of 1812 kind of forgotten, or why do we yawn? Why is it undervalued as a significant event in the history of the United States?
I wish I had a good answer, but the answer I'll give you is this. The war was remembered from 1815, particularly the Battle of New Orleans. There's the fiction, Americans believe they won the war, actually it was a tie, all the way up until 1861, when there was a national crisis of the American Civil War that lasted, 4 years. And that was a watershed in American history. Things that happened before it were easily forgotten because there was so much that came out of the American Civil War. Eventually the Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age and all that kind of good stuff that really grabbed America's attention. So I think the Mexican War, some of the initial wars with Native Americans and the War of 1812, that's old stuff. So that's the best answer I can give you.
Wasn't the last battle after the treaty was signed?
Yes, Battle of New Orleans was fought in January of 1815, a couple weeks after the treaty was signed. But remember, the treaty that was signed and again didn't even make it to the United States until the middle of February. Now, the Parliament had already ratified it. It got to the Senate and they just rubber stamped it as quick as they could. And the very next day, President Madison declared it, because a treaty has to be declared into law. And so it was, I think, around the 18th of February when the war was officially over, except for some warships on the high seas that didn't get the word.
Okay. One last question. It lasted 3 years, that war. Why is it called the War of 1812?
No, it was called the Second War with Great Britain. And I'm not exactly sure when it became the War of 1812, probably in the 1830s, when people started referring to it as the War of 1812. So they didn't call it that immediately. I taught a class in ROTC back in Eastern Kentucky University, and I opened my class on American military history. And when I get to the War of 1812, I asked the people, I said, who won the War of 1812? And blank stares. One student just raises his hand. He just insisted on having the answer. I said, okay, who won the War of 1812? And he said, Tchaikovsky. There are only 2 War of 1812 jokes that I'm aware of. You've heard them both. Please, sir.
Rich, we'll make these the last 2 questions of the evening.
Could you talk a little bit about whether this was a real turning point for the indigenous tribes of the United States and Lower Canada? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Andrew Jackson wrote the treaty for the Creeks, and he treated his Creek allies just as badly as he treated the Red Sticks. And they gave up, 80% of Creek lands were given over to the state government. So that was pretty horrific. And in the West, William Henry Harrison was one of the guys who was doing these peace treaties prior to the war. And a lot of the peace treaties were, you get 5 or 6 chiefs who say they own all of Illinois, and they sign all of Illinois over to the federal government. Well, they didn't represent the people living there. They represented their own tribes, and so they made a good deal because the Americans were going to give them all sorts of steel weapons and steel pots and clothing and wool blankets and all sorts of gifts because the chiefs signed the peace treaty. So they were, by and large, phony treaties. But after Tecumseh's gone, there's no leader who's willing to unite the tribes. Hey, we tried that once, it didn't work. And the Native American unity kind of disappeared from that point on, right up until the Black Hawk War, and then one last push, the Sioux War in the 1870s. Yeah, it was. No one can agree today, the scholars cannot agree who won the War of 1812, but we all agree who lost it, and it was the Native Americans, the indigenous population. They lost. Sir.
I have 2 questions. Thank you for coming. And
Thank you for coming.
I want to know about Dolly Madison, and is that story for real? And the other one is, it sounds like we were broke for a long time from the war, and how did Andrew Jackson pull off that new bank thing?
Oh, boy, I can't answer that second question. That's a tough one. The second U.S. bank, yeah. But let me go to Dolly Madison. The portrait of George, the life-size portrait of George Washington. Okay, it's in a frame. The frame is nailed to the walls of the White House. A couple folks, gentlemen with buggies, pull up to the White House. The British are on the way. They offer to help Dolly to take what she can and pull it out of the White House, to save what she can. Madison is not there. He's with his cabinet elsewhere. So Dolly and James are separated at the time. The way I understand the story, Dolly grabs one of her butlers, and they cut the oil painting out of the frame, roll it up, hand it to these guys in the carriage, who drive off with it, and then later, after the British evacuate, these gentlemen start bringing stuff back into, the broken White House, the burned White House. So where the painting goes initially, I don't know. But that story of Dolly Madison, it's my understanding that's absolutely true, to save that painting in Washington. What should you read? Don Hickey writes a book, War of 1812. I think he calls it The Forgotten War. I knew that title came from somewhere. But Donald Hickey wrote a very popular piece. It doesn't speak much to the military action, but it talks about the political and the economic from the beginning of the war right through to the end. So Don Hickey is an author you want to go to. If you're interested in the military stuff, you want to go with a Canadian by the name of Don Graves. He's written several books about combat in Canada. Very well researched, well written. I would go straight to him. So those are the two authors I would point you to. Donald Hickey, an American, and Donald Graves, a Canadian.
Rich, thank you so much. We're not going to wait 8 years to get you back here. Thank you all again tonight. Just one more word on the parking. Hopefully it's not as much of an ordeal for you to get out, but you'll go through that same gate on 40, whichever street it is, and you might think that gate's not going to open. Just inch your car up there. You got to get it up pretty close for that gate to open up. But we have a gentleman there who will help you out as well. Thanks again.